Post World War poetry or poetry after Second World War. We have discussed poetry of T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, W.H. Auden during the time of first half of 20th century. In second half, we have three significant or four significant poets. I mean, Philip Larkin, Seamus Heaney, Ted Hughes, and Dylan Thomas. In poetry, we see challenge to modernist ideas of poetry that were trying to make poetry a more intellectual activity than, you can say, a mean of expressing emotions, or uh, a medium of uh, uh, medium of expressing something in lyrical mode. So we see a lyrical, ironical form of poetry that is seen, that is taken as the Philip Larkin's poetry. The year after 1945 saw both continuities and changes in English poetry. Some poets continued romantic traditions, writing deeply personal responses to the world and engaging with eternal elemental themes. The central viewpoint in their poems is an I, a single voice rather than impersonal voice of modernist poetry. Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet who wrote first 18 poems, was felt to be a poet who could restore poetry in English a romantic vigor and flamboyance after the anxious, uncertain tones of T.S. Eliot. यानी ये समझा गया कि टी.एस. एलियट ने जो रोमांटिक पोइट्री को तबाह किया है, और अब कोई पोइट जो इसको दोबारा से वो विगर दे सकता है, वापस ला सकता है, तो डिलन टॉमस. In Dylan Thomas poems, there is the struggle to give expression to very powerful feelings. So powerful feelings that were denied as a subject matter in Eliot's version of poetry, they were re-emphasized by Dylan Thomas. Many of Thomas' poems are dense in meaning, and the images are frequently wild and surreal images, but his tone is bold and affirmative. Dylan Thomas' poetry is sometimes obscure, it is sometimes moving in its simplicity, it is frequently very original in its selection and combination of words. Fernhill is one of his best poem. Dylan Thomas' reputation for hard drinking attached more attention than his poetry. Thomas was born and brought up in Wales, and the Welsh traditions of the power of the spoken words are present in his poetry. He writes with an elegic appreciation of natural forces, the forces of birth, sex, and death, and with a rhapsodic regret for all that is lost in death. His best poems affirm with great passion and vigor the joys and beauties of life, even in the mid of death. Much of modern poetry continues Dylan Thomas' affirmation of life over death. Next, we see there is a group of poetry or school of poetry that is known as the movement. Philip Larkin is, you can say, the most influential poet of this group, which is called the movement. The movement poetry that was a reaction of high modernism of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and other poets. Movement was a short-lived and was never very homogeneous as a group. Its poet, they had different tradition. For example, Philip Larkin, he was a skeptic and atheist who doesn't believe in God. And there was Elizabeth Jennings. She was Catholic Christian, devoted Catholic Christian poet. And but both are part of the one movement that is called the movement. Donald Davy, डीजे अनराइट, सब डीजे अनराइट की पोएम अभी रिकॉल कर सकते हैं. द रेबल बीए के सिलेबस में है. These are the poets who belong to that the movement. Purpose of this movement was to get rid of high flown romanticism and bring it down to earth, can be seen to have been realized in the work of the movement poets. Their work contrasted both with the high emotion and verbal effusion of Dylan Thomas and with modernist tradition of Eliot and Pound. The novelist Kingsley Amis and John Wayne were also associated with that movement. By the way, Philip Larkin was also a novelist. By profession, he was a librarian, but he was a prose writer, a novelist who couldn't earn his reputation as a novelist, and then he turned to poetry. Thomas Hardy, he was a novelist, he turned to poetry, but he was equally successful in both genre and probably more successful as a novelist. But Philip Larkin is remembered for his poetry, not for his novels. Larkin likes to write in straightforward, direct idiom that is lyrical and ironical, and it presents the human condition in post World War time when human beings are living in a chaotic, fragmentary life and they fail to associate with the sources of rebirth or revival. Movement poets wanted to show that there is a different way of perceiving the world. Most of the poetry of the movement is thought a reaction to both romanticism and modernism. D.J. Wright, who taught English literature in the Far East, and his view of cultural differences and misunderstanding is a distinctive and ironic one. Philip Larkin's poetry plays with against the romantic tradition in poetry. Larkin does not assert the importance of his own personal experience. His vision is realistic and unsentimental, preferring to be indirect and ironic. He continues the tradition of romantic poets such as Wordsworth and Thomas Hardy. Often he is associated with Thomas Hardy instead of Wordsworth. With Wordsworth, he only shares the point of simplicity. Larkin explores eternal themes of death and change with its established rhythm and syntax. He generally uses conservative poetic forms rather than free verse and that type of modern poetic form. Like Thomas Hardy, Larkin writes about what appears to be normal and everyday while exploring the paradox that the mundane is both familiar and limited. In Poetry of Departure, Philip Larkin contrasts decisive romantic gesture of action with more cautious decision to leave things as they are. He knows that this is less likely to be approved. The Whitson weddings, that is his collection of poetry, he describes couples attempting to give their lives some happiness and order, but concludes that happiness is something which only happens elsewhere outside our lives in the past rather than in present. In this way, he owns pessimistic response towards life. In an introduction to his controversial anthology, The Oxford Book of 20th Century English Words, Larkin underlines the importance of a native English tradition, which he sees through Hardy. That's why he connects with Thomas Hardy and Christina Rossetti instead of the modernist tradition of Eliot, Pound, Auden. Philip Larkin underlines the importance of native English tradition as opposed to modernist influence and gives considerable space to Chaucer, Wordsworth, Hardy, Auden, with Hardy seen as a major poet of modern period. Larkin's eye is quiet and unsentimental. He appears to be simultaneously a romantic poet who is distrustful of certain aspect of romanticism. Mean he likes the lyricism of romantics, but he does not own the revolutionary thoughts of romantic era. He is certainly not a poet who can sing in his chains like the sea or use such language as time held me green and dying. That type of poetry is not uh, created by Philip Larkin. Larkin's poem, Church Going, Mr. Bellini, Ambulance, they are his famous poems and in which we can understand what type of modern imagery is seen there, how he treats the idea of death, how he shows that modern man cannot relate with church and church is seems to him just a building and objects there are just artifact instead of something that uh, uh, from which uh, spiritual resurrection is possible. He also shows uh, Mr. Bellini as an example of a contemporary man, a man uh, who is actually seen through his representation through media like radio, and he is not different from others, being conformist, 9 to 5 routine, and like every Tom, Dick, Harry, that's a man whose individuality is threatened. Tom Gunn is a poet whose poetic collection is New Lines. He is also one of the poets of the movement. Next poet I would mention, he has his own significance. He also became poet laureate. Uh, John Benjamin. John Benjamin was a poet laureate before Ted Hughes. He is also significant post-World War British poet. And Ted Hughes, who is known for his poem like Hawk's Monologue, Folks Thought, uh, Red Moon, and Little Freda. Ted Hughes is a poet who believes in the Manichaean civilization. Manichaean civilization is ancient Babylonian civilization that has faith in ongoing conflict in good and evil. There is a duality of two gods, duality of good and evil, where things are understood in their contrast. Second, he is preoccupied with the idea of violence and energy. What was seen in Victorian poetry as nature in tooth and claw, that nature is, as you can say, source of intellect for Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes in university, he was student of English literature, but he left that department and he chose to be uh, trained and studied in anthropology and archaeology. And these two branches of knowledge polished his historic sense, or you can say cultural sense. He showed profound interest in London Zoological Garden, and you can say about animals. Animals who are subject matter of D.H. Lawrence poetry, D.H. Lawrence novels. Lawrence is also fond of animal imagery, and Dylan Thomas, who also writes about animals. But the vigor and energy that we see in animals projected in Ted Hughes poetry, that is unique and marvelous. And that helps to understand us what nature or human nature is. So violence, which is, you can say, much debated in later half of 20th century and first two half of 21st century, and we hear such slogans कि फलां वाला मजहब जो है वो तशद्दुद पसंद है, और वो आगे से कह रहे होते हैं नहीं जी बड़ा अमन पसंद है, हमारे तो मजहब का नाम ही सलामती है, हम तो हर किसी के लिए सलामती है, और सारे जो वायलेंट अटैक्स होते हैं वो उसी सलामती वाले मजहब के पैरोकारों ने किए होते हैं. So that type of things are seen कि arguments and counter arguments and accusation and counter accusations are there. And a writer tries to find out that where is violence. Violence is part of human nature. Very like violence, or you can say the strife of might is right, that can be seen in animal world, that can be in human world. Ted Hughes is also very much notorious poet, I can say, because he was much criticized for the suicide of his wife, an American poetess, Sylvia Plath. In his you can say later years, he actually betrayed his wife, his I mean Sylvia Plath. So he had an affair with a British actress, and Sylvia Plath, who committed suicide just at the age of 33 in 1963. He was accused for the cause of suicide. Later on, he uh, even published her work, and also uh, published diaries of his wife, and wrote certain poems like his wife. Sorry, the poem is Her Husband, and in which he tries to defend himself. Uh, his daughter Freda, she is also a poet, and she has commented on, you can say, side, I mean, her father's and feminist side. Ted Hughes' poetry emphasizes the pitiless and violent forces of nature. Many of his poems focus on animals who pursue their lives with a single-minded strength and power, like hawk roosting, where we can see that hawk imagines itself as monarch of all the survey, and hawks believes that it is his right to tear and kill. He thinks that it has been in the past and it will continue in the future. Hawks who thinks that nature has contributed to make him in this dictatorial fascist thinking that is represented in Hawks roosting. So single-minded strength and power is seen in there. Some of the animals he depicts are not so much violent as vigorous, with a sharp sense of survival. I mean, some are violent because of their survival, and some are violent because of their violent nature. Ted Hughes makes his readers aware of the prehistory of the natural world, stressing its indifference to man. His poems Pike, Jaguar, Thrushes, Wind are totally without sentimentality. The natural forces are viewed with a harsher eye than D.H. Lawrence, you can say, compassionate eye. From the world of animals, D.H. Lawrence learns a life of peace, a life of beauty. But from, Ted Hughes learns through the animal world, more violent world. His best known poem हॉक roosting BMA ये सिलेबस में शामिल है हॉक्स मोनोलॉग इसका टाइटल किया गया है which is cast as a monologue. Hughes presents the hawk as a powerful bird that catches and eats smaller birds and animals. The hawk states that everything in nature has been arranged for its own convenience, like sun, like earth, like trees, like uh, uh, ambience of wind. It assumes that the existence of other birds and animals as its prey is part of the purpose of creation. बनाई कायनात इसलिए कि एक जो जानवर है वो बाकी जानवरों को चीर फाड़ करके, और ये वो थिंकिंग है जो हम अपने अंदर भी देख सकते हैं. मैंने तो बचपन से यही सुनता आया हूँ कि ये दुनिया इंसान के लिए बनी है, तो इंसान जितने मर्जी बकरों को खाता जाए, मुर्गों को खाता जाए, और ये जो गाय है, भैंस है, इनसे जितना दबा के फायदा लिया जा सकते हैं लिया जाए. ये दुनिया जो है वो सिर्फ इंसान के लिए बनी है और इंसान अशरफुल मखलूकात है. ये वाला विजन है. ये हॉक से मेरा नहीं ख्याल कि हॉक से बिल्कुल कोई मुख्तलिफ सोच है. हॉक जिस तरह ये कहता है कि बाकी परिंदे उसके शिकार के लिए पैदा हुए थे, उसने शिकार कर लिए तो अच्छा ही किया. His eye and his strong personality. Eye in a pun on eye will ensure that this situation does not change. I kill where I please because it is all mine. My manners are tearing off heads, the allotment of death. The sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like that. These are the best lines of this poem and shares the crux. Many critics have equated this state of mind with the psychology of a totalitarian dictator, like Stalin, General Franco, Tito Marshall, Saudi kings, Chinese rulers, and many others. The Hawks' words and actions relate to forces underlying both human and animal experience. The word hawk is applied to politicians who believe in the use of force to resolve political problems. Ted Hughes has become more preoccupied with myths and legend, particularly in his, you can say, later work that is called Crow. Crow retells the creation story from the point of view of a violent anarchic consciousness. Ted Hughes' poetry is contrasted with Larkin's gentle, urbane, and introspective manner. यानी एक तरफ जो मुहज़्ज़ब किस्म की दुनिया है फिलिप लार्किन की और दूसरी तरफ जंगल है, वहशत है, दरिंदगी है टेड ह्यूज की पोइट्री. So Ted Hughes, with his own philosophy, philosophy of conflict, philosophy of violent nature, philosophy of war, philosophy of might is right, or critique of all these ideas, he appears. Last important poet is Seamus. He is an Irishman. As an Irishman, many of his poems deal with the horrors which continue to afflict Northern Ireland. In his early poems, Heaney writes of the countryside and the natural world in ways uh, which suggest the influence of Lawrence and Ted Hughes. I mean, he has also vision of nature, but his vision of nature is more elemental. As Ted Hughes uses his uh, thought fox, drawing a comparison of arrival of the thought or arrival of the creative thought on paper with arrival of folks coming out of a forest to the door of the poet's room. So writing a poem from idea to concrete form that is compared with the arrival of folks. So natural world appears as a metaphor for poetry in Ted Hughes' poetry, but in Seamus, digging is a metaphor, where स्क्वैट पेन यानी जो रंबा है जिससे गोडी वगैरह करते हैं वो पेन का एक पैरेलल मेटाफर बनता है. Seamus establishes the metaphor which recurs in different ways in several subsequent poems. As he says, between my finger and my thumb the squared pen rests, I will dig with it. कि पेन जो है उसके हाथ में ऐसे है जैसे किसी किसान के हाथ में रंबा होता है खेत में गोडी करने के लिए, तो जैसे वो जमीन को खोद के उसका जो है वो डिग करते हैं, इसी तरह एज ए पोइट ही विल डिग इनटू द सॉइल. तो इस तरह से वो अपना आयरिश ईडियम, अपना रूरल ईडियम जो है वो अपने पोइटिक ईडियम में ट्रांसलेट करता है एंड शोज दैट जॉब ऑफ पोइट इज टू डिग. अब डिग के भी दो कॉन्नोटेशंस हैं. एक तो वही है कि आप अपनी रूट्स तक पहुंचने की कोशिश करते हैं, और दूसरा जो आयरिश में हिस्ट्री है जिसको शायद छुपाने की कोशिश की जाती थी, बट दैट वाज ब्रॉट ऑन सरफेस. Seamus in his poems on one side are about rural experience, Irish rural experience. On the other side, there are Bogue poems. Heaney digs into his own memory, into the lives of his family, into the past of Irish history, and into the deeper levels of legend and myth which shape the character of people of Ireland. Seamus Heaney attempts to go beyond the terrible daily events of life in Northern Ireland to discover the forces beneath the history of that country, which might restore hope and comfort. Seamus Heaney does not hide the deep-rooted tribal passions of revenge and honor which endure in contemporary society. Seamus Heaney, who was awarded Nobel Prize in 1995, set the seal of his worldwide reputation as the major Irish poet. Uh, North is title of one of his collection of poetry. He also wrote Door into the Dark. Then he wrote Bogue poems. Bogue poems are actually about uh, uh, the contemporary researches about bogs in Ireland. These bogs were actually discovered where the human beings were buried alive in Iron Age or before Iron Age. You can say before 3000 years ago. It is found that there was a myth that fertility needs human blood. So for the sake of fertile soil, the human beings were buried alive. Yeah, one person was buried alive. That was a ritual of human sacrifice that was performed in the way to get fertility of the soil, and later on you can say better crops. That was cruelty of you can say countrymen for their own countrymen. And that has been discovered by the Danish archaeologist. And Seamus Heaney has also seen certain evacuations uh, which are called finds. These finds are available in Irish Museum as well. Uh, one of such poems is Tolman, that is included in master syllabus. So Seamus Heaney tries to draw a comparison of bogs which have been discovered and contemporary Irish history where young men are victims of violence for the sake of their country. And Ireland, that has a long history of struggle against Britain for freedom, liberty, though dominant part got freedom in 1921, we can say a century ago, and but still there is uh, unrest, and there are a lot of problems in Northern Ireland. In his essays and academic writing, Seamus is perceptive and sometimes polemical. He is particularly acute in his writings on poets and poetry. His best known lecture, The Redress of Poetry, we are aware of. He also wrote Yeats as an example that ends with words of praise for one of Yeats' last poems. Uh, in an essay, England's of the Mind, Seamus Heaney discussed the poetry of Ted Hughes. फिलिप लार्किन एंड जॉफरी हिल, यानी इन तीन की पोइट्री जो है वो इंग्लैंड ऑफ द माइंड में डिस्कस की गई है. ही कंट्रास्ट Geoffrey Hill's primitive landscape and Larkin cityscapes. Hill is a poet of an other England. He searches for the roots of English identity in historical, linguistic, and cultural terms in the region of Mercia, the West Midlands. In redress of poetry, Seamus